Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this online seminar of the Illiberalism study program at the George Washington University. My name is Marlène Laruelle. I'm delighted to receive you today for this really wonderful discussion around the book launch Culture War in Europe. We are online, recorded as well, and I'm delighted to chair this event. We launched this initiative on culture war in Europe and Eurasia during COVID time, in fact. And in 2022, thanks to Heather, who will be presenting in a minute, we had the possibility of commissioning really a wonderful group of scholars from very different disciplinary background, from Western and Central Eastern Europe, from Northern and from Southern Europe, and also scholars who look at what is happening in the US and are comparing with Europe around this notion of culture war, which has been a very classic topics for those who worked on the US, but less for Europe. And so all put together, this kind of more than 40 pieces that are now in this book, Culture War in Europe, really give us a really extraordinary analysis of what is happening in the different national contexts in Europe, but also a kind of self-reflection about our own positionality as scholars, as citizens, as human beings toward this discussion or this concept of culture war, which is really not an easy one. And for that today, for this discussion, we have three authors with us. So let me introduce them very briefly. Well, first, Heather Kovacs, a PhD, political scientist, assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna in Austria. And she was a non-residential research fellow at the Illiberalism study program for more than a year, where when she was collecting all this incredible article and working with authors. We also have two authors with us. We have Andrzej Slachalek, who works at the Department of Political Science in the Faculty of Art at Charles University in Prague, and who has been edited also really great work that I recommend, Central European Culture War Beyond Postcommunism and Populism. And last but not least, we have with us Massimo Perellini, historian, senior advisor of migration at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, who before 2015 was a researcher on sexuality and movies at the University of Cologne in Germany. So a great group of scholars who are here with us today. And I know I see many authors who contributed to the volume who are here also in the room, so it's great to see everybody. And Heather, I will give you the floor to lead the discussion and have your presentation, Andrzej and Massimo, and then I will lead the Q&A session at the end of the talk. Thank you so much, and Esther, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you so many people for joining us today for this book launch. As you have noticed, the book is already online, so while we are speaking, you can already read it, but no, don't do that, read it afterwards. I would like to thank Marlène Laruelle a lot that she made this book actually possible, and she commissioned me and asked me to design this series and invite authors to this series. And I would like to thank John Chrobak, who assisted us all the way long for publishing all the texts and now putting together all these series as a book together. So thank you, Marlène, and thank you, John, for making this possible. I come from the research on the right wing, and especially on how the right wing in Germany and Hungary politicized the term gender and how they attacked everything what they thought was connected to gender, or what they mean by gender madness or gender ideology. And I come from a country, Hungary, where the right wing has been on power for 13 years and where they have all the means, all the resources, and all the intentions to fuel culture wars and to stigmatize sexual and gender minorities or migrants or whoever pleases them at the moment. And they use culture wars to for short-term and long-term political goals. However, what I have noticed over the last years was, I mean, it will not be a surprise to any of you here in the room, but I got more and more frustrated with how we analyze all the time the right wing, whereas the liberal or progressive side is also part of the game and also has often stakes in fueling culture wars. What was also very striking is that many of the culture wars, what we are witnessing now, are fought within the so-called progressive side. So it's not even between left and right, but also between those who call themselves progressive, or even if they don't call themselves, but they are all committed to social justice, to human rights. They just have another conception about that, and they fight it out very fiercely. So I was also puzzled after a second, I mean, not puzzled, but I saw, probably we don't have only two sides in this debate. And that's why I liked very much that John Hrobak chose the Berlin molecule fighters for the cover of the book. And on the picture, we see only two figures fighting, whereas there are three actually, but from one angle you see only two of them. So I think it expresses a bit what we tried with the book. And the third point was, so besides that the liberal progressive side is also feeling, besides that there are probably not only two sides, that the academia is also playing a role in all of this. So academia is not just analyzing what the culture war parties are doing, but they are also part of the culture wars, both in terms of concepts that they take from activists into their academic work, or they give concepts to the activists. So on this conceptual part, but also within their academic works, many academics work as or function as activists themselves. So I thought that it would be good to look at all of this together and not just looking at what the right wing is doing, but adding all these dynamics to that. And I emphasize it is adding and not replacing. So I continue to be convinced that we need to complement it and not replace it. The right wing is still obviously on place and using culture wars in their politics. However, without these aspects, I don't think we can get a full picture. So we invited authors. And as Marlene said, we have over 40 authors actually represented in the volume who have something interesting to say. They come from various disciplines, from anthropology to psychology, from philosophy to sociology. They come from different methodological paradigms. They come from different ideological convictions, and also from different views on how academia and politics should be or should not be connected. And we asked them to contribute to this series on a topic which they think is relevant or which relates to their fields and their interests. We also wanted to make a dialogue between the US and Europe. So the term culture war itself was coined in and for the United States. However, it has been also used in Europe very much a lot. So starting by that, but there are a lot of concepts that are originated in the US and are now very much used in Europe. So let's look at them, whether or not or to what extent they help understand the processes here in Europe, or rather hide away things. But we also wanted to initiate a dialogue between Eastern Europe and the West. And by West, I mean US and Western Europe. And not only that, the Eastern Europeans should be included as subjects of, as objects of study, or that they explain their own regional experiences, but that all are also experts on those topics where they were required to write. So we have approximately 50-50 division in the book, which which I am very proud of, that we managed that. I don't think that it happens a lot to Central and Eastern Europeans in topics and in books which are not about their region in Europe, especially in the context of post-colonial studies, and all our ideas about the global, in these global justice movements, are about global North versus global South, and the former second world, Central and Eastern Europe, rarely finds a place in these imaginaries. But you will notice when you open up the table of contents that the book is not exhaustive in any ways. So that is also the risky part of this endeavor. It is not exhaustive in terms of countries. So there are many countries from Europe that are not covered, or there are no authors from, like France or Southern Europe. There are other countries where there is only one author coming only, for instance, Denmark or Poland. Then there are topics which are missing, although we tried to find authors from them, or they are just very barely touched in the papers, but they would definitely merit more scrutiny, like the huge prostitution, sex work debate, or the war in Ukraine, or the critical race theory debates arriving to Europe too. So obviously it is not a full book covering everything, every aspect, and obviously to each topic, not all possible approaches are there. So it is a risky endeavor in the sense that we have a lot of topics, but it's not fully covered. I guess every country or every topic would deserve a volume like this with over 30 papers. So bear with us and take it as these are the limits, and but we are aware, and we believe that it's nevertheless 36 excellent papers that give a lot of food for thought. What you will also find if you open up the book, that you will not find any one coherent narrative of the papers. So the authors represent very different views and convictions also on these issues. So sometimes the papers talk to each other and reference each other, or discuss with each other, other times no. But some papers think that this is the way forward, and the other paper says, no, this is exactly the core of the problem. So the issue is that there will be no one solution, and there is no guiding narrative behind the book. If there is one, then that is the idea of pluralism, and pluralism not in the sense of relativism, of anything goes and everybody should be happy and say whatever he or she wants, but rather in the sense that in many of these topics, these culture wars stop us to debate them, or people invested in framing them as culture wars don't want all aspects come to the forefront. So I believe that this is where we tried to make a statement against, and also the authors who are in the book are together now with people with whom they, or with many of whom they disagree. So I hope that the book in itself as a book will show that it has its merits and it's necessary. Before I give the floor to Ondřej Slačalek, who wrote a paper on the symmetrism in the culture wars, and to Massimo Perinelli, who will talk about his paper on anti-racism and what are the problems of racism, anti-racism in Europe from a specific perspective. So before I give the floor to them, I would like to thank the authors I can see here in the room, because there are many of them here with us. So let me thank that you contributed to our series and that you are here, and at later point, please join the discussion and give also your thoughts. So thank you very much, Malte Breiding. Thank you, Lidia Balog, Zora Hesova, Zuzana Magyarova, Judith Suissa, Veronika Valkovičová, Tove Zoiland, Katja Kalina, Floris Biskamp, Tanja Vuckovic-Juros, Mari Nicolini, Silvia Horváth, Ulrich Brandt, Hans Christian Petersen, and Agnes Patak-Falvi. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for writing to the series, and please join the discussion afterwards. So now I would I thank to all of you who came, not only the authors, but also the audience to this book launch. And now I would give the floor to Andrzej Slačalek to say some words about his paper and what he thinks important for us to know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much also for this organizing and intellectually organizing effort put into this book. And I think it's great exactly because it is not exhausting, because if it would be at this point of debate exhausting, it would be boring. I think what can be contribution of this book is not to be exhausting, but to be opening, because while there was a lot of conversations about culture wars, I think still we didn't have many of them which are needed, which need to be waged, and we miss them. And I hope that exactly this book, exactly because it's quite open structure, and exactly because form of academic essays and not the proper academic papers targeted into great journals, can open this kind of conversation. I agree that culture wars are not affair of two sides, but still I will start with two sides as they are important for some self-definition of culture wars. And it's exactly because culture wars are connected with, or their part is story about culture wars and story of origins. If we think about two most important sides of culture wars, they both have their own story of origin. And this story somehow implies some golden age before. For liberals, it's very often story of backlash, which is described in Esther's essay. Like there were some good times, and then some strange people came, and be it Putin and his followers and agents in Eastern Europe, or be it Trump and some ignorance, and destroyed this golden age, and we have to come back to struggle, some medieval struggles which should be already solved. But also on conservative side, there is that story of origins, of, okay, we had our normal time where men were men and women were women, and we could accept liberals because they were more or less rationalists, and we could somehow discuss with them. But then they became crazy and they started to destroy our normal world. And both these stories, of course, have some elements of truth, but in the same time, they are part of the conflict. And I think what is very important point of departure is somehow to denaturalize them, challenge them, and try to analyze cultural conflict from different point of view. And I think the most important aspect of some different point of view is focus on relatedness, focus on, in fact, co-constitutive nature of sides in culture wars. Yeah, of course, we can spend a lot of time by debate if this one side of culture wars should be labeled as conservatives or as populist or something like that. But we cannot make a mistake if we characterize it as anti-liberal. The enemy is somehow very important, much more important than the positive side of our political position. And it applies also for opposite side. And I think it's depicted in Biskamp's essay about fascism and anti-fascism, like how this image of fascism as some ultimate evil is reconstructed in culture wars. And of course, it's not only co-constitute our side and our positive self-view, because yeah, we are anti-fascist, we struggle with the worst enemy of the human race in the whole history, but also it prevents us against any possibility of compromise. And it changes nature of politics, because politics is based on compromise at some point. But we cannot have compromise with fascists, of course. So it brings us to some concept of absolute enemy. I try to understand culture wars as some different version of moral panics. While in moral panic, there was some mainstream which was haunting some folk devil. In this context, mainstream divided into more or less symmetrical sides, and they are hunting each other. And it brings us to position of some eternal concentration, eternal focus on moral scandal, which is caused only by existence of opposite side. And of course, this focus is transforming, not only is transforming us, because it's of course makes many conversation very complicated, because as political positions are based on relation to our enemy, we cannot accept many arguments simply because they were posed by enemy. And it creates exactly the moment when our identity is changed while we even do not notice. I think it was quite interestingly depicted in an essay of Veronika Grzyb about transformation of Polish feminist movement, and how, and I think some of her findings are very relevant also for other milieus and other countries. How somehow happened that, okay, before it was tabooized to speak about women's experience from reactionary Catholic conservative position, and now it can be also problematized from progressive position. But also, this can have some unexpected, this transformation can have some unexpected results. For example, exactly this radicalization caused by this concept of absolute enemy can make actors of culture wars publicly unacceptable and discredit their cause. What was, I think, quite depicted in a quite great way by Roman Kuhar in his essay. And also, I think there are some other examples. I think, for example, struggle of Polish ultra-conservatives against abortion consensus to make it even make Polish abortion law even worse or even more repressive. In fact, discredited not only this effort, but also the whole abortion consensus, even on its former supporters. So there is something what can be called relatedness of culture wars and co-constitutive character of its sides, which brings about transformation. There are two other aspects of those wars, one can be called obsession with representation. Yeah, because of course now we have really take seriously the adjective culture in culture wars, because very often representation is what matters. Yeah? It's important to follow how reality is represented, and I think it was great to have one section in the book about academia and how academia becomes battlefield of it. But of course, there is another battlefield in popular culture. And popular culture and academia become somehow privileged target and privileged battlefield of culture wars, what somehow brings about towards replacement of politics. Because of course it's too boring to debate about tax changes as basis for redistribution. It's much more stimulating to debate about how new academic book about feminist theories represent correctly or incorrectly experience of some minority, or how some minority experience is reconstructed and represented in some new Netflix series. But it's of course brings us somehow far away from politics. And somehow it also brings about us far away from many previous debates about representation, because this representation becoming the battlefield often have to fail in its function to have some strong relation with what is represented, but in the same time have option to say something new, because correct represented meanings are already expected. And what is symbolical is the importance of author. We 40, 50 years ago, for a long time, there was debate about death of author. John Bartes could pretend author is dead. Now, definitely, if something is clear, that author is not dead, that author and his proper behavior or her proper behavior and proper set of positions makes representation correct or incorrect. And last aspect of culture wars today is something what I would call death of context, because there are a few aspects of it, but of course it's aspect of social media and all that talk about liquidity and volatility of various contexts and crisis of institutions which had responsibility to define context, be it academia, be it, for example, media and especially press media, daily news connected with press. But it's also, and of course, it's individualization and something what could be called individualized right for his or her context to be judged and to be understood in our own context. But in the same time, of course, what we see, and it was very visible, for example, in essay of Hans Christian Petersen, but also in others, that, and also in Massimo Perinelli's essay, actually, that there is one context which is much more important than others, and it's concept of something what I would call, with quotation of Václav Bělohradský, US metropolitan provincialism. Yeah, that idea that, okay, the most important patterns for emancipation, for understanding inequalities, for understanding politics actually comes from the US, and we can we can appropriate them mostly by adapting US terms and US concepts and understanding US context. And of course, this is not ideology which would be expressed in words which are used, but it's ideology which is deeply behind, I think, many of us or all of us, which we somehow live in, and even those who politically challenge this often follow this by its form. For example, especially after Black Lives Matter, we had some waves of so-called decolonization movement, which raised some very important questions about coloniality, about racism. But what was some strange internal paradox was this, that the rhetoric of this movement, its political language and like conceptual point of view was completely based in the US political lessons, in US political vocabulary and in US experience. And this story of, which is super important, story of US Black people was somehow adapted on Central Eastern Roma, on relationship towards between European West and European East and so on, where it didn't work, simply didn't work. And what leads me to conclusion, we often hear, let's escape culture wars, let's skip it, let's do something what really matters. And I deeply believe that we can't escape it, that it's something, I'm existentialist here, I'm sorry. We are in, and there is too many important emancipatory goals and existential fears in it that we cannot simply escape it. But what we hopefully can is try to change their form and to escape their totality, escape, to cultivate some interspaces. And here I really like say by Sarah Speck and Paula Irenvilla, and about differences between academia and politics. And of course, these differences are relative, but this relativity is really important. And also by naming some problematical practices present on all sides, even our sides in culture wars, by their name, and also by localizing and provincializing various contexts and changing direction, making non-US experience relevant. And I think this book is really a contribution to it. I think its contribution is exactly that. It is not our internal Central Eastern European talk or some global talk. The majority of authors are from the US and from Western Europe, but in this mixture. And I hope that this conversation will continue. So here I will end. Thank you very much.
Massimo?
Yeah, shall I continue? All right. Yes, thank you again for having me here, and also to introduce a little bit my paper and try to give some connections also to other texts. I've been invited to write about critical whiteness as a powerful aspect of identity politics within anti-racism in Germany, especially about the problem of the concept, about the problems with the concept. In the text, I speak from the perspective of migrant struggles in the horizon of overcoming racist forms of domination. And I want to defend and strengthen these struggles with my text. And this is my motivation to participate in the project on culture wars. And I think it's important that we always tell each other our motivations, because there are many critiques, for example, of identity politics, which follow a very different agenda. So this is my agenda, since I am part since 25 years in this migrant struggles against racism. Basically, I find that most arguments on the topic of critical whiteness are unsatisfactory because they either look at the political practice that is carried out in the name of critical whiteness, or only at the theoretical concepts or theories, and then miss the reality of the political. So I did not call the problem of critical whiteness policies a culture war in my text, but try to understand them as an expression of an authoritarian turn. However, this perspective fits very well, I think, into the question of the book and can be found quite similar in many of the contributions. The questions of authoritarianism is closely connected with the problem of culture wars, especially within the left, and this is where what I talk about too. Valuable about the concept of critical whiteness, as you all know, is its potential to make difference between different social positions and actors visible. Thus, the normative affiliation to the profiteers of racism can now itself be analyzed as a construct. Whiteness as an invisible norm becomes visible in its constructedness and thus attackable. And much of the critical whiteness research is concerned with the question of undoing, unlearning, even betraying one's ascribed position in society. Race Trader, for example, in the early 90s, the journal edited by Noel Ignatieff was an extremely important intervention in this perspective. So this is important for me. For the beginning, critical whiteness was a very valuable intervention in the 90s to deconstruct the normative in the construction of race in an abolitionist stance. So the theory intervention developed historically in the US in the 1960s and 70s, especially in the feminist struggles and the conflicts between Black women and the white-dominated women's movement at that time. And quite a few articles in the book widely looking at the debates within feminism to understand the political urge, the theories and the problems of identity politics and culture wars. So I think this is also brilliant in the book. That these debates emerged primarily in the US is not surprising because racism there was and still is on a very different scale in Europe, an anti-Black racism to maintain white supremacy. This has its roots in the history of slavery or in the social order of the US, which is based on slavery, and even after its abolition is rooted in the systematic, structural and violent disenfranchisement and oppression of the Black population. The term racism was first coined in the US for the current struggles for liberation in the 70s, 20 years before anyone here in Germany ever used the word. In Germany, the term racism, also in left debates, was not used at all, or if only in the memory of the racial biological extermination project of the National Socialism, or in the current form of the apartheid in South Africa, or for the US-American social order. This is the only moment where the term racism is used. It was not used for Germany, not even the struggles of the guest workers in the 1970s or 80s against their disenfranchisement and exploitation. It was not until the fall of the Berlin Wall that the term racism was used to describe the conditions here. But then when the pogroms began with the process of the German unification and arson attacks and other often deadly attacks against foreigners, against Ausländer as it was still called at that time, people suddenly spoke of racism here. And anti-racism became the defining field of a cross-current left movement. Racism was spelled out, theorized, and anti-racism organized at countless demos, actions, no border camps, and so on. And here too, it was migrant actors who had decisively advanced these debates. So that dynamic can be designated as the birth of the post-migrant. That is an attitude that assumes that Germany is a thoroughly migrant society. This attitude was forcefully represented by the second generation of the former guest workers. In the heated debates against racist violence in the 1990s, there was a theoretical debate that had placed the situated knowledge that emerged out of the experience of migration centrally to the debate. It was an anti-identitarian intervention that declared and celebrated the migrant, that is, the ambiguous, the hybrid, the impure, as the new normal. They said, we don't belong to Turkey, to Spain, to Greece anymore, but we also know that we will never become Germans, never be integrated. So we said then at that time that this is not a problem, but a richness, because we are at home everywhere in the neighborhoods, in the diversity, in the potentiality of the society of the many. At that time, this intervention really changed everything. The left, theory, literature, music, cinema, the image of Germany as an immigration country. I further described that by the mid-2000s, this theoretical, political, and aesthetic impulse had lost its power. The anti-racist movement lost momentum. Many of its protagonists became professionalized at universities and in institutions. The Nazi street terror of the 90s disappeared, and the political void emerged. And in the mid to late 2000s, identity politics and authoritarian groups broke into this political void, basically sealing the end of these movements, I would say. This is one of my main thesis in the text. Under the term of critical whiteness, which had little to do with the political concept of Noel Ignatieff and others, anti-racist assemblies were attacked, groups and individuals were denounced and intimidated as racist, and an entire movement was cancelled. This text in the name of critical whiteness dealt with theorems and concepts that were taken over from the US and transformed to the local conditions. However, references to US groups like the Combahee River Collective from the 1970s do not apply to history of racism in Germany. What was consciously, I would say, overlooked was that Germany or Europe has a different history of racism than the US, where racism above all means the ideology of white supremacy against the black population, the formerly enslaved population. In Germany, a Völkisch nationalism prevails to this day, especially the anti-Slavic racism, which is boiling up again these days in the debate about the war in Ukraine, is denied from the critical whiteness corner. Because in their thinking, there cannot be racism against whites. The current attempt to label refugees from the Ukraine today as Europeans like us and to play them off against the old enemy, Russia, renders invisible the fact that people from Ukraine have been for decades here in this country, been discriminated and exploited in Germany. They have been treated no differently than migrants from Russia, Kazakhstan, and the other many states of the former Soviet Union. And as Hans Christian Petersen aptly summarized in the plea for an eastward expansion of the German debate on racism, the construction of the category race in Germany context cannot be understood only through the skin color. Besides that, a German history of crimes during the short-lived colonial period with the genocides in East Africa, today in Namibia, at the beginning of the 20th century, is also a different dynamic than in the US. Likewise, of course, as you all know, eliminatory anti-Ziganism and anti-Semitism, which industrially murdered millions of people, does not enter into the theorem of whiteness. Nor does the racist exploitation and disenfranchisement of recent migrants, primarily from Southern Europe, fit onto the US foil of racial politics. Certainly, Black Germans face massive racism too. The catching up debate about today's police violence and racial profiling speaks to this. Yet Black Germans occupy different social positions than African Americans in the United States. In this country, the disenfranchised and devalued work was performed by the foreign and forced laborers under National Socialism, that is the European slave laborers. And after the war, they were replaced by guest workers from Portugal, Spain, Yugoslavia, Turkey, Morocco, and so on. The academic reference of the German critical whiteness community to the US narratives of the diaspora makes invisible that in the early 1970s, it was primarily the guest workers who struggled and bled in Germany, both in the factory and outside. So you can say it's class blindness. What we can observe in the current identity political, I would say in the neoliberal anti-racism, is a fatal separation of different actors and the mutual hierarchization based on competition. Today in the German anti-racist discourse, a distinction is made between racism and migrantism, between BIPOCs and migrants, which are then sorted according to cultural criteria and racialized phenotypes, especially the skin color. This is a mirror image of the very categories that racism has forced upon us. In the 90s, again, the multi-faced migrant youth identified strongly with black youth, with the black youth in the US. The term black was militantly adopted at that time as a political category. And instead of differences, the focus was on similarities and resistance, such as rap music as language of the voiceless. And today we are light years away from that because these categories are neatly separated and the affiliations are fiercely guarded, I would say. So what is needed, and I conclude here to keep my 10 minutes, is a political solidarity that does not envy the privilege of the privileged, but appropriates and transforms it itself to the creation of solidary ways of relationships. Solidarity, along with freedom and equality, as the third promise of the Enlightenment, is given a new central status today, or that's what's needed. What is needed. This would be the opposite of an identitarian and authoritarian retreat into the group of supposed equals. People are never identical, that's my last sentence, in their identities, and it's precisely out of these contradictions that they become capable of emancipating themselves. And yeah, I conclude here. Thanks.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for, sorry, I can hear some echoes. Thank you so much for this wonderful three presentations. I think that are given just a very slight insight about the richness of the book and the depths of the discussion that are happening in the book. I'm inviting people online to ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. I have two for the moment. Let me ask them to you. We have about like 12, 13 minutes. One is about the place of religion, or the kind of reinvented, secularized religion as a culture, right, as an identity phenomenon in this culture war. Could we interpret this culture war as being kind of moral war that are very much shaped by a kind of secular religiosity? That's one of the questions. And the second one, which kind of partly parallel what Massimo was just saying about culture war, can we consider culture war the product of neoliberalism in the sense that it's pushing ideology to be kind of atomized in every individual and be kind of interpreted as something read as a kind of part of an individual experience and be kind of celebrated or pushed as something very kind of individualistic interpretation of the differences between human beings. So two big questions. I don't know which of you would like to begin for one or the other.
I can try. Yeah, these are two very big questions, and I would be also very curious what Andre and Massimo are saying, but probably starting with the second one, whether or not this is a neoliberal phenomenon. So actually you are asking something about the progressive side again. So we are so on the sense of, you know, or how they are contributing to the culture wars. And I would subscribe actually to the view what also Massimo was saying, that it is and also he wrote in his piece about the deep resignation and the deep pessimism of current identity politics activism, actually, that we gave up on the analysis and on the hope that we can change bigger social structures, and the maximum we can strive for is finding our very special identities or policing others on theirs, and whether or not they have privileges and they can speak to the debate in a strict hierarchical order, and also the obsession with representation, what Ondřej was mentioning. So I would situate it, and also the individualization of structural problems, so gender inequality or racism or many other issues are very much narrowed down to attitudes, and also trying to influence the thinking of the people. So not just the behavior, like don't discriminate or let's fight for a bigger fight, but you have to signal, and this is the religious part actually, signal regularly that you belong to the creed, and that you say, you put your pronouns, you use the correct language of post-colonialism, you openly, or so I would say that these things are connected, and actually I think it's Magdalena Grzyb's paper who also compares this far right, conservative right religiosity with some of the progressive views, how that is also a bit religious. I don't know, what do you think, Massimo and Ondřej?
I can go on, Ondřej.
Okay, I will maybe follow that answer on second question. I am a little bit wondering about speaking about neoliberalism, because neoliberalism is ideology or movement, and I'm afraid that we are often in temptation to consider it as something like omnipresent evil, which is responsible for almost everything. And I think, so I prefer to speak about something, but on the other hand, I agree with Esther that there is strong individualist moment. And I prefer to speak about real individualism as some counterpart to real socialism. And it's, of course, society created by neoliberal ideology and movement, but not only by it. It was co-created by human rights movement and by people who honestly consider themselves being opponents of neoliberals. But they also had their important part in shaping this real individualist society from the greatest motivation which they could have. Actually, the question about moral nature of culture war is really great. And I agree that this is continuation of moralization of politics by various means. But what is, I think, interesting is that combination of morality and culture nature of this conflict, because moral approach to politics somehow should imply that morality does not belong to anybody, that it's universal, that there is no group which has privileged approach to being moral. But actually, in culture wars, morality becomes very often attribute of some group, of our group, of course, and sometimes even of attribute of some ethnic or religious group. For example, in Islamophobic mobilizations, Muslims are depicted as being immoral by their only existence and adherence to this religion. So there is, I think, strange combination of this moralism and culturalism. What makes this discourse deeply connected with morality, but in the same time, deeply distanced from any reasonable, meaningful conversation about morality, which pretends independence of morality on any stable group.
I try to answer a little bit from a different perspective. I think that when you see that the migrant struggles in the civil rights movement in the 80s and 90s, which was huge, it was all about rights, like civil rights to gain, and the question of belonging to the society. And so the whole struggle and where the theory emerged, like in the 90s, was about this question. And what happened then in the 2000s also was like 9/11 and a new wave of ongoing wars in the Middle East, and then a new kind of racism emerged, and anti-Muslimic racism, which did not fit into the analysis of like economic exploitation, as the second generation of the guest workers were talking about, that racism is all about exploitation and keeping the people disenfranchised. But this notion of anti-Muslim racism developed a split within the migrant societies, which was fought out on a cultural level. And that was new, and that was also something the organized migrant movement and anti-racist movement had no answer to this new kind of racism. And I think neoliberalism is important because what we can observe today is like a loss of the understanding to be part of a society and an individualization where people speak only in terms of me and the ones who are like me. This is the identitarian group, but it's a loss of the other, like the stranger, and it's getting back on that. And for me, it's like this times today, it's like trapped in a radical presence, like in an interregnum where the old died, but the new cannot be born, as Gramsci put it. And I think this is an expression or an outcome of neoliberalism. But we have to spell out what that means in particular. I would also say, or what I think also when I read the book, your book, and that's the term of moral panic is very interesting, because this is, I think, the emotion which is the strongest, like it's anxiety today, and not a good political way to deal with that. And I think one way to deal with it is going back in the identitarian group and not facing to a fantasy or a notion of a future, an unknown future. Everybody's afraid of that, of the unknown future. But when you go back to revolutionary times, it's always the people going back or projecting into a future they don't know, but they desire. And this is absent today, totally, I would say.
Thank you so much. And maybe very briefly, one last question about the transnational aspect of culture war and the fact that when we read the chapters in the book, we can see how much it's national, right? How much the national context matter, how much the different political actors, the vocabulary, the way the semantic space is built, it's very national, right? Each country, even inside, Southern Europe, Central Europe, you have national context that really matter. So how do we articulate that kind of deep cultural, like national context, and the fact that it is a transnational movement, right? As scholar, how do we try to think both the national and the transnational context at the same time? And I think after that question, which is also a big one, we will be stopping. Esther, do you want to begin?
I mean, how I understood the papers written, they were modest or humble, rather, like not to overstate something or not to overgeneralize to something which they don't know enough. But when I was reading them one after each other and like reading a paper which dissects some Danish developments by Malte Breiding, and then I recognized a lot of things what I have observed in Germany, for instance, where I was living for a long time, or what Tove Zoiland is bringing in about the discourses about the anti-COVID measures in Switzerland speaks very much to the paper in Hungary about Hungary, although they don't know each other, the two authors. And so there are a lot of things, and I think it makes the papers more serious if they concentrate on the case they know most, where they have the empirical data, or what Massimo did with the reconstructing also the history of German anti-racist activism, because only then can he say that actually what is happening now with the import of critical whiteness, it cancels all the history. But at the same time, it speaks to something which goes way beyond that one context where others can recognize themselves. So this is at least how I saw the connection between the national, which is small enough, but it speaks to the transnational.
Great, but Andre or Massimo, would you like to add very briefly something on that aspect?
Maybe there is important disbalance that we still cannot have real political debate outside of nation state. But we already have majority of important inputs for this debate produced transnationally, be it in academia, be it by, I don't know, transnational corporation, be it by some various transnational processes, the inputs for these debates, or be it by social movements, which are to quite a huge extent transnational. So there is strong disbalance, which may be, we can't have political debate, which would be really transnational, but we almost can't have academic debate, which would be really national. So it's maybe something what brings us back to late medieval period with academic Latin. Now we have academic English, and with this kind of disbalance, and I think we still cannot predict what will be results of this disbalance.
Yeah, just very briefly, I would say that the transnational is also something we lost over the last 2-3 decades. And I gave some examples, just brief random examples, like from the 90s, like when migrant youth here took the term of Black for themselves and related to youth in the US. Or the Zapatistas in Mexico invited the whole world to discuss with them, which is very like anti-national, and the whole discussions of new way to see like global intertwining in the movement of the play in the squares, in the debates of Negri Heart Empire and so on. So we had a lot of transnational references at that time, and they are lost today very strongly. And like the import of critical whiteness, for example, is not a transnational thing, it's just an import. So I think it would be interesting or very necessary to go back into the history where we were, like to the debates that already took place.
Yeah, great comment. Thank you so much. Well, we are already running out of time, so I wanted to thank the three of you for this great presentation and for the contribution you kind of added for those who are online. And I hope everybody will be downloading the book and circulate it, because we really think it's a major contribution to the debates with really wonderful examples and case studies, and also very deep kind of conceptual contribution. So thank you to all of those who contributed. A special thanks, of course, to Esther, who really was leading the project for 1.5 years and who was able to bring everybody together. That was a great contribution. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope we will see you very soon in some of our other events, and wishing everybody a nice summer that is arriving soon. And please download the book and circulate it. Thank you. Bye-bye.